attention in the 2012-2013, I immediately knew we had a significant problem because this industry had been there. And when I go to the peer-reviewed literature and all my access to sources, I find out that there was essentially, as you heard, no papers. There was no research, which was astounding to me. Trained as a formal biomedical researcher, there should have been quite a bit of studies along the line. And so that immediately raised the flag to me that we had a systemic, if you want to call it, manifestation of a broken healthcare system. And I learned later that, in fact, there were a lot of federal agencies that were manipulated in various ways. And so because of some of that, we also have not created a federal system that's strong in healthcare for national public health. And I'll talk again more about that. So with that, I have it's always a self-disclosure statement that I have, for the foreseeable future, am a fossil energy user. And that's just the way it is. But I also say that as a healthcare professional compared to medical studies, we seek to self-educate and disseminate knowledge and participate in civil actions that lead to improved health and environmentally friendly practices for its discovery, uses, in the future of the planet. I think anyone that's a professional in this area and or not needs to consider ascribing to that. So with that, I always like a few quotes, and there's no question that we can have all of the energy that we want, but if we're not healthy, it really won't matter one bit. And so the measure of the greatness is certainly by the healthy people that live within it. And as Jiddu says, it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. And we are taking that latter quote more commonly every day. And of course, Winston Churchill knew it best as healthy citizens are the greatest asset. So if we do not have a system by which we can generate and expect good health, we will have a massive problem. And it's a very expensive problem, as you know. So this talk, I'm going to spend a little time on what I consider to be the compendium. It was mentioned earlier. This is now a 151-page document. It's the third edition. And it is by far the best compilation of peer-reviewed information. And so this is the beginning of the building blocks. And then I'll talk a little bit about health impacts of fracking, associated products, the national and state geospatial relationships. Unfortunately, the state the data is no good. There's not enough granularity, so we can't talk about it. I will talk about one specific case that I think we need to pay great attention to that has some statistical correlations that look interesting. And then, if I have some time, the anatomy of what I consider a colossal failure in big government with our HHS and our overarching public health system. So if you didn't know it or not, the state of Ohio, I grew up on the east side of Cleveland, around Chagrin Falls, and have been spending my time growing up at our lake home since I was yee-high to a grasshopper. And so for me to be back and to have seen what happened over the year is these large fossil fuel accumulations have been, as early as the 1800s, some of the best oil in the world came from these parts, and it was sitting literally on the surface. So we had an oil rush in the 1800s here in Ohio and Pennsylvania. Then we had the coal rush in the 60s, which led to some of the most significant environmental degradation. It was never followed up. There are data sets, however, from some of this period that need to be remined, and they, by the way, correlate with some of the poorest health indices of the counties that are associated with these, so that's not unusual. And so you have this poor health that's been going on since at least the 50s, 60s, and 70s that are blurred into the context of now the gas rush. And so good luck trying to sort that out. There's been perpetual poor health in the southeastern part of the state for at least 60 years now. So you have got this problem, very little money, lower socioeconomic standards, and so nothing's been put into that part of the state. It'll continue, of course, until we do more. So since the Warren meeting, data is so critical to the process. Again, I told you there were a handful of few papers. You saw that earlier from the other presenters. And so there are now the third edition, 4 multi-volume government reports since the 2013 Warren meeting. Of course, the New York ban and the environmental impact report that came out was critical to that, and we have got people in the audience, and I give them tremendous credit for being part of that process. Hopefully that'll continue. And then we have the IOM, the Institute of Medicine, which held only a workshop summary, and I'll get back to how the IOM plays a role, or should play a role in this, and they recently released that report of that summary. So here is what I'm going to take some selected pieces from this report that's just come out. So this is a group, I'm actually part of this group as a veterinarian comparative scientist. It's an affiliate of International Collaborative Networks of Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. That was back in '85, where a Nobel Peace Prize was won from the group. The latest publication now has 653 footnoted, peer-reviewed and cited scientific, medical, and journalistic findings. What's really encouraging, as you heard, are the number of studies that have grown out of this since the beginning. Now, the sad part of this is we're almost 15 years behind the curve on this, which is an astounding thing to hear for an industry which has affected probably right now at minimum 18 million Americans, most likely 30 million Americans. 18 million Americans will be within a mile and a half of this active fracking activity. Take the rest of it, we'll probably be at 30 million, who knows what the number is. So we're talking 10% of the population. And we have essentially no money and data put in from our federal research and education system. It's astounding. So you need to ask yourself really, really hardly why that and how that can happen. So what do we know from the findings briefly? There's no question that they now conclude these are peer-reviewed data sets. In 2013, 2012, there was some discussions of assumptions. Now it's documented. So this is very important that that's occurred. It's occurred, though, however, in a vacuum of no federal money. This has come from people that have pulled things together from existing resources that were never intended to have done this. And so thank God for that activity and a lot of dedicated people taking that. It would be like me in oncology and infectious diseases area, having been challenged with something like that, having no money, and then trying to figure out what the hell's going on with this infection. I mean, how many people are being affected by it? And I'm pulling it out of my bank account, much like Leah has actually done. So it doesn't work. We can't operate that way. So anyways, we now know that the regulations are simply not capable of preventing harm. The fracking contaminates drinking water, both locally and at long distances. We now know these facts. Drilling and fracking emissions contribute to the toxic air pollution and the smog level ozone effects. Public health problems associated with drilling and fracking, including occupational health and safety problems. We know all these are now known facts. Natural gas is a bigger threat to the climate than previously believed. Earthquakes are clearly now correlated, Oklahoma being the epicenter of that work, with over 1,000 earthquakes now annually. Can you imagine the effect of that on this beautiful building right here? Fracking infrastructure poses potential exposure risks to those living near it. We now know that drilling, fracking, and agriculture takes land out of production. We'll talk about that. There's some astounding data here. Drilling and fracking activities bring naturally occurring radioactive materials to the surface. These are all absolutely documented now. Then the risks posed in California also represent a unique instance where the state behavior and practices are different. And then 11, the economic instabilities of fracking further exacerbate the public health risks. So the evidence about regulations, essentially we now know that all of these structures and this technology is incomplete. It fails at a pretty regular rate, and over time it fails. You have to ask yourself again, how is it that we don't have a regulatory system that takes and checks technologies before they're regulated and released onto the unsuspecting public? That would be the analogous form for me of me and my company developing a drug or a preventative vaccine and essentially being able to come into Columbus, Ohio, and start immunizing people and children willingly, and then waiting to see how well it worked. Now you have to ask yourself, what happened to our system that doesn't put the same requirements on the technologies that are going to be used in that same way? That is something that has to be reckoned with immediately and going forward. So that's one of them. I'm just jumping through these quickly for sake of time as well. I want to get to a few major points. In addition, last March, that what we now know is that there's significant deformations. The idea that this was deep in the ground, don't have to worry, all of that has completely changed now with all kinds of geospatial monitoring. There's great deformations and completely uncontrolled losses in fluid movement. So all of that is now documented. The drinking water issues have been absolutely documented, both local and at great distances. And now even the EPA finally has weighed in with their report and has found that to happen. Now, can you imagine that we're at 2013 to 16 and the EPA is first weighing in on this problem, which has over 25 years of practice? You cannot understand how that possibly can happen. It cannot continue on. Why are we seeing what's happening with the local and national election? Is because people have started to get the sense that something's wrong. Well, it's significantly broken, and things have got to change in the federal processes at all levels. But we better talk about health first, because otherwise we're going to have significant social economic effects from that immediately and long-lasting. So again, the water issue is an absolute no question anymore. And then if we get on to the toxic air pollution, this is some astounding data that's come from it. So the gas wells in rural Ohio, the levels of the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons surpassed downtown Chicago. This is collected data from monitors that were put out in the field with people and in the area. They're 10 times higher than that found without fracking operations around them, raising the lifetime risks for cancer, of course, in those areas by 45%. These are unsuspecting, innocent citizens, and we've allowed that system to come in and be able to do that. They can go ahead and burn a plume, and it's just going to sit right over that particular location is the notion. Now, how incredibly naive must that be? And that we can have a system that allows for that to be practiced into unsuspecting people in America. It blows me away. 2 reports from California, disproportionate areas suffering from serious air quality problems, and the ozone issues are compounded significantly. So you have that situation compounded with the volatiles that are part of the fracking. Also, if we look at in the drilling and fracking operations now, the air pollutants include, of course, benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene, the BTEX group. Now, this is a very, very important point, is that these are what are called endocrine disruptors, which you may not appreciate as well what that means, but essentially a family of these molecules which cause to both young, adult, and older, but particularly in the young, cause endocrine hormonal changes and regulate those in such a way so that a developing young man or young woman has these things affecting the direction at which either their estrogen or testosterone, all of their hormone bases are now being pointed in the wrong direction and made toxic in ways that we still don't understand. Those are serious implications, particularly for young and developing people. And I'm going to talk to you more about what I see in that area, which is very disturbing. And I hope actually we can leverage with this problem nationally. So you've got this problem. We've known it's been going on for a while. There are additional components to this endocrine disruption, but this is significant because it's a volatile aromatic exchange. So this is very serious. Residents living within 3 miles of fracking wells in rural Ohio, they found those levels. I had mentioned that already. Okay. Now, I don't know if you followed, this was a major methane leak that occurred in California. It was methane storage. They don't know actually what happened, but can you imagine that they have megatonnage of stored methane in California? What a great place to be, given its own natural predilection for earthquakes and fracturing. It contains an enormous amount. This was the largest leak on record, which was, as the numbers you see there, that picture down below is actually during the process of the leak. That had to be an infrared. The picture on the right is actual infrared. That's not a regular picture. That, if it was taken with a regular camera video, would have looked like nothing was on that picture. Had you not done it by infrared, you would not see it. Those are the plumes of methane and the associated gases that are contained in that. and the other is a stylized three-dimensional representation of the enormity of this. This release lasted for 4 months approximately. It was 110 days before it was reported to local and federal agencies. And a large family community called Porter Ranch is affected. It's a upper middle class community of hundreds and hundreds of families have now been exposed in a tremendous way. And I have yet to see any organized activity where that group and those families are going to be studied now, serially long-term or not. None of that is being looked at. I see no money on the table. We see no interest in doing that. If this normally would have been a healthy America with a healthier public health system, that would have had CDC people dispersed to that area. There would be continued long-term studies, and impacts would be done on all of that. This has to be studied. This is a situation where the methane release on that community as an episodic release has to be followed, and we have no money and infrastructure for doing this whatsoever. So this will be lost, as far as I know as of today. Now, this study from Johns Hopkins that was part of the PRS summary is very significant. Basically found 40% increase in the risk of preterm births among infants born to mothers living nearby, drilling in Pennsylvania. Now, the reason this is so important to get this piece of data is in 2013, the strongest correlation that I could find in doing some of the meta-analysis nationwide, because there wasn't good enough data in Ohio, is that preterm births had an interesting partial statistical correlation to the fracking industry. I'm going to share with you that data now to give you some idea of what that looks like, and it is statistically very, very interesting. I don't know if you know this, but the U.S. ranks at the bottom in terms of preterm and infant mortality. The bottom, okay? We're 130th. And you have to ask yourself, what's going on there? Now, why is this important? Is because in any of these toxicities, the canary in the mine, so to speak, are either environmental surveillances such as amphibians, fish, other life forms that have very sensitive indices to toxicities. The other next sort of surrogate marker of health are the very young and pregnant mothers. Because what you have there are situations where there is a rapid turnover and development of cells in a growing fetus and a young growing person. Those cells are uniquely susceptible because of their metabolic state at being able to be affected and sensing then toxicities to that, and they're expressed much more rapidly and immediately in that setting. So that is one of your best surrogate markers and indicators that you want to pay attention to in a state or nation that's getting sick. This has been ignored for way too long, and it needs to be addressed. So I'll share with you now, when these are all adjusted, you can't explain this yet. It's not socioeconomic, simply. So now I'm going to share with you the meta-analysis crudely that was done. So here is your oil and gas industry. Just look at that, try to burn that in your head. This is pattern recognition for now, but it's good enough. There's our distribution system. There's the number of active wells in the states. They sit over, you can see it. They all make a nice pattern. And now look at the blue. Now those are all the states with the highest rates. So infant mortality is an important indicator of the health of a nation. The recent stagnation, of course, has generated great concern among researchers and policymakers, not apparently enough of others. And so the rise of 36% since '84 is unexplained. I found that so far, if you look at every other adjustment that you can make, the only other superimposition along with the statistical meta-analysis suggests that there's something going on because of oil and gas and the distribution here in the U.S. So I think we have enough of an idea here that this needs to be drilled down. This should be one of the hottest areas given the finding now of the researchers with the focal analysis in Pennsylvania by the Hopkins researchers. And this should receive a tremendous amount of attention. I think the fact that we're talking about mothers and the young and unborn is also something that might just wake a few people up, because sometimes it gets to someone that's otherwise pretty hardcore. So I think this one we really need to drill down on and pay attention to and leverage. I can't do that every day with what I'm currently doing, but I'm looking to make some connections where we can do that. So moving on, rest of some of the findings, of course, the climate effects, I think are well characterized, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. We certainly know about the earthquake situations now. There's absolutely no question whatsoever about that. The infrastructure and fracking, of course, the potential exposure risk to those living near it, those are very well characterized now. And the other facilities, kinds of things, not just the fracking processes, but the compressor stations, all these are semi-permanent activities, and so they're there for a very long time. Those all have to be addressed. The radioactive activity is still way underappreciated, and the way it's being handled. Can you imagine we're spreading that around for dust control on our county roads or ice control? Can you even imagine that? How that can be allowed? It's beyond any kind of conscionable thinking. California has also its unique set of problems. I'm not necessarily going to go into that. They're addressing that, but literally millions of people are very close to those operations, and significantly those in the Fort Worth, Dallas area, Texas, have high population densities sitting on top of these activities. As we look up around Akron, Canton, and Youngstown, we're going to find the same kind of things where we have the encroachment. The zoning issues are going to be critical to dealing with that. It's already a lot too late. We're going to be doing a lot of management of health problems, for sure. Okay, so again, more about some of the issues with California. I think you want to take a look in the lower part down there. Can you believe that Chevron was able to pipe 8 million gallons of the treated frac waste for crop irrigation just so they didn't want to waste that water? And they found that subsequent crop irrigation distribution led to incorporation into the plants. The plants were subsequently shipped, and probably we may have participated in eating some of that as well. So you've got this incredible system that's going on in places where you don't believe, well, it doesn't affect me, and guess what? It's sitting on your shelf. So we've got a lot of issues, to say the least. This is one I want to wrap up from the report on, and those are to pay attention, again, into the red. The accumulating land degradation in the continent-wide for the U.S. as measured by the reduced amount of carbon absorbed by plants is getting to be significant now. The land occupied by well pads, roads, and storage facilities built during the period, approximately 3 million hectares, roughly the land area of 3 Yellowstone parks right now we're at. And the most interesting aspect of this is very early, but look at the very bottom. The disturbance of plant and soil systems linked to this process found that none of the oil and gas plants included in the study could return to pre-drilling conditions for over 20 to 50 years. So this makes even the kind of, when we were doing the strip mining for coal, we thought that some of the reclamations would probably be on the order of 10 or 20 years. This is going to make that look like child's play. So these long-term effects are just barely beginning to be studied as well. So anyways, to say the least, it's not just the single operation that we're talking about, but the multiple aspects of the whole industry have to be looked at. Again, you have to ask yourself, how do these technologies get that far down the line without some sort of regulatory approval like we require of everything else in this country before it gets to people? Okay, so I'm going to jump ahead. We now know the list of pure known carcinogens that are a part of this as well. Multi-systems are affected by all of these collectively. So we're going to have multi-systems failure here across the board. We're going to have long-term endocrine disruption across the board. And we're talking about animals and humans. The same is occurring for all of the associated food animals, pet animals, particularly food animals. Those mean food animals, so you're going to get your milk, you're going to get your meats, your chicken, so on and so forth. Free range may not be such a good thing anymore as they free range themselves right into a toxic environment. All these are things you have to think about that are affected by the dynamics of this. This was a picture that's actually in some of the literature. I'm not going to spend too much time except to say that these are now well-documented sets of chemicals that are well-documented in terms of their effects. We don't know their episodic effects or long-term. These can have very chronic, insidious kinds of clinical presentations that require months to years to completely understand. We will have to contribute and donate billions of dollars over the long haul to be able to monitor what we've already created. And that's, I don't see anywhere in the capital budget right now, nor is the willingness there. So we have a completely broken system on top of this right now. So there has to be some fundamental changes here. You got to call for major changes. So this is what I'm going to wrap up on. I mentioned a little bit as well. We have this healthcare system, a federal healthcare system. We have our local and state healthcare systems. One would like to think that the federal healthcare system is the one that's protecting us again from bad drugs, bad biologics, all of those things. It's doing a reasonably good job there. But where are the federal protections for technologies that otherwise bring these practices across the state and across the nation to people? And they are not there. And we have to have an FDA for technologies and energy. We have to have those kinds of agencies that oversee the development and gets their regulatory approval before they're released on Americans. So we have a colossal failure of the system. Now, whether that has been cut out of the system, I don't know. But I do know how the system works because I've been there. And it's not working or allowed to work. And I think it may be the latter to some extent, because I know there's a lot of really good people that would love to work on these things that are at those institutes, at the Surgeon General on down from the HHS. And so something's not right here in Washington. Not that we know it's always not been right in Washington for quite some time. So we have the systems. This is your national health care system, if you haven't seen it. Under HHS and inclusive of the umbrella are the Centers for Disease Control. They've not investigated one single piece that I know of. And that's our epidemiology center that we pay and we count on to monitor the health for the United States. There are no EIS officers running out to the frack sites to investigate these communities. Not one. You have your NIH and you have your NIOSH. Look at the infrastructure of that bloated government healthcare system to protect you. I highlighted those in red that by absolute no question have a role in this. And so you have to ask yourselves how they integrate with the Department of Labor, Occupational OSHA, and of course EPA. These are all agencies that should be integrated, and they're not talking to each other. If it was the drugs and biologics, you'd know what the connections are. We know what those are. And even that's not perfect, so can you imagine when we don't have the system currently set up the way it is? There's no system set up to come from that side of the equation in industry to protecting U.S. citizens. It's a fundamental flaw in our design, totally. And that has to be changed. So those of you that have insight and ability, we better get going on that one quickly. So let's see, I'm going to make a couple of other interesting comments, and I'm going to get off because I think I'm staying between you and lunch, which is a dangerous thing at this time because I imagine you're hungry. Those box lunches look great over there, so we want to get you over there. Two things to think about, a couple of papers that have been published but not made much of that I found fascinating. If we look at the Earth as we start to understand sort of the geologic, geospatial energy, developmental aspects of the planet and other planets in the solar system, we actually are realizing that the Earth as it is and as it supports life is unique in lots of ways. But its construction, as you'll see there, has aspects that have to do with the geothermal sort of activity that maintains the internal heat from the inside of the planet out. And so the oil and gas reserves that make up some of that matrix, actually it looks like by geophysicists and people that are in that field, act much like subcutaneous fat under your skin that keep you warm or cold and insulate you or protect you. And so they actually have a huge effect on regulating temperatures that come out from the core. We're stripping those out. We're transferring inordinately much more heat. It's still to be measured. And so the additional warming may actually be contributed by, as we take that out, we're essentially losing part of that insulating capacity to add to the global warming. So if that wasn't bad enough, you have this now going on. Again, how you are allowed to participate in those kind of dynamics without understanding that are beyond me. And this one I'll leave you with, which is astounding for me, and that is the geomicrobiome. Now, I don't know if you've heard microbiome. It's kind of the cool thing today. Since we were able to sequence the human genome about 12 years ago, and now we can do it on a chip in less than a day. I've been working with my teams at different agencies in my companies that do this massive sequencing. And so we've learned tremendous things about the distribution and complexity of life and the interconnectedness of it. Well, guess what? The deep earth is not dead. It is performing what are called extremophiles, bacteria that we didn't know existed are there, and they're performing chemistries in oxygen completely depleted environments. They need no oxygen. In fact, oxygen is very toxic to them. They live off of other things that are like cyanide and sulfur. And so they're doing chemistry here like we've never seen going on. It's like the ocean, but it's in the strata of the earth. And we're completely, it would be like us going in and plundering and doing fracking in the ocean at some minor component of that, which is not so minor anymore. So we're talking about all those dynamics. I think what needs to be done, an interesting wrinkle on this would be is that you characterize this geomicrobiome to understand it and its enormity and extent, and it becomes all of a sudden like the great white spotted owl or something, essentially. And we start asking ourselves about disturbing that, because that will be like the tundra in terms of its complex, unique environment. So I'll leave you with those interesting ponderings and musings, and thank you for your time. Have a good meeting.